Hello, my name is Alexander Sokol, and this is the second day, first section of the second day of the workshop on Autoencoder market models for the interest rates. Yesterday, we discussed the general, concept of interest rate model construction, and we built autoencoders and of autoencoders as well, and then we built a variational autoencoder for the yield curve. Today, we will use this variational autoencoder. In fact, two types of autoencoder with different dimensions of latent space to construct during the first session today risk-neutral models for the interest rates, and during the second session, real-world models for the interest rates. After today, during the first session, after we discuss how autoencoders are used in model construction, we'll come back to the autoencoders we built yesterday and examine them in the context of their specific use for interest rate models. So there will be this hands-on portion there that will perhaps run some Python scripts, so just look at the results of the scripts that I previously ran and see, how this autoencoders that we built, how they, with the benefit of knowing what, how we're going to insert them into interest rate models and what they will be replacing in classical models. All right, so let's move on. Okay, one moment. Somehow I'm not able to advance. Okay, now I can. First of all, today we're talking about risk-neutral models, right? It's a risk-neutral measure. Risk-neutral models are used for pricing, interest rate derivatives, historical, and of course, more recently, value adjustments, XVA. And they take into account not only the real-world probability distribution of future risk factors, but also the market price of risk, right? So traders, when they price derivatives, they don't like risk, and they assign higher probability to adverse events, lower probability to favorable events, and that skews the probability distribution if it's, if it's a diffusion and changes the drift. And in order to avoid having to model the market price of risk explicitly, usually it's combined together with the probability. The market price of risk adjustment is combined with the probability to obtain what's called a risk-neutral probability. It's a quasi-probability that combines the two. And with risk-neutral probability, we no longer have to think about the market price of risk. We can simply compute expectations within the model. Okay, so in order for us to consider the time value of money, we need a numeric asset. So the numeric asset is something that we use to keep track of the time value of money. And the stochastic discount factor from time t small to time t capital is the ratio of the value of numeric asset today and the value of numeric asset at maturity. So a risk-neutral model must satisfy an arbitrage condition, actually a large number or a series, a universe of no arbitrage conditions, such that for any contingent claim that pays no cash flows between times t small and t capital, the current value of that claim at t small, this earlier time, is the expectation of, in all possible future states of the world that the model predicts, is the expectation of the value, future value of this contingent claim or asset, times the stochastic discount factor. You take the expectation over what the model, over risk-neutral probability in the model, conditional on today's state variable of the model X. And this condition is extraordinarily broad because it has to hold for every asset, because if it doesn't, then there is arbitrage in the market and arbitrageurs will be taking advantage of it and taking your money until equilibrium is restored. So there's no arbitrage condition just because it applies to any asset. It's a extraordinarily complex set of constraints. And it will not be an exaggeration to say that satisfying these constraints is often, the bulk of the challenge, the main challenge in constructing a real risk control model. Okay, now there are several popular types of interest rate models, right? And they are, the granddaddy of everything, right? So the one-factor short rate model, the two-factor short rate model, and the whole curve model. So we'll discuss them one by one and show how you can start from classical models in each of the three categories and build a model that's based on an autoencoder. In doing this, we will only look today, right, just because of the time constraints, at deterministic volatility versions of these models. Right? So deterministic volatility means that volatility is a deterministic function of the rate level. And in order to build deterministic volatility autoencoder market model, we will need to, we will use the autoencoder. The autoencoder will encode only the yield curve, but not the volatility surface. We discussed it yesterday. So to get stochastic volatility IMM model of the encoder market model, you need to encode both the yield curve and the volatility, and perhaps add a latent variable to do that. Today, we'll be discussing only deterministic volatility autoencoder market models. And for that, we will only encode the yield curve, but not the volatility surface. The volatility surface will become deterministic function of the curve, as it is, in any deterministic volatility model. That's what deterministic volatility means, right? So it doesn't mean that it doesn't change, right? It just means that it's deterministic function of the curve. All right, so we start from one-factor short rate models. One-factor short rate models have a sole state variable, only one state variable, the short rate, right? We will define to be the interest rates for borrowing over an infinitesimal time period between t small and t small plus dt. There is an alternative definition which uses small but finite investment periods. Sometimes it's chosen to be the time step of the numerical method. And it's only helpful in the context of numerical methods to define the short rate as the rate over a finite period. So we will not use this definition here. We will use definition of continuous or infinitesimal investment period for continuous definition of the short rate. The numeraire asset in risk-neutral short rate models is the money market account accruing continuously compounded interest at the short rate. And according to this, the stochastic discount factor is given by this expression is the exponent of minus the integral of the short rate between over the future path of a short rate in the model from today t small, right, to maturity. I wanted to remind that if anybody has questions, please put them in the chat and I'll answer them at the suitable point during the workshop. Okay, so now what's going on here? Somehow I cannot advance again. Okay, right. So now in short rate models, the yield curve is a function of the short rate, right? And in risk neutral term structure model with a single state variable in general, arbitrage-free constraints on yield curve evolution make the entire yield curve shape a deterministic function of a single state variable. And given that everything in the yield curve, including a short end, the short rate, is a deterministic function of one variable, we can simply say that the short rate is that variable, right? It makes it very convenient. So the discount factor is seen at time t small for payment at time t capital, can be obtained by substituting by basically this asset that we're talking about is just a single cash flow at time t capital. So the discount factor is the expectation of that expression here. And the last argument, R of t, means that discount factor, or the curve shape, right? So because the discount factor is a function of maturity, determines the curve shape, is a deterministic function of the short rate. Okay, so instantaneous forward curve is the forward rate for investment over a future infinitesimal time period interval. So the short rate is the rate of return for the immediate next period, right? So it's from today to tomorrow, or from now to the next minute, and so forth, right? So infinitesimal time period happening immediately after the current point in time. The instantaneous forward curve, the first argument there is when you observe the forward rate. In a second argument, T capital, is the start of the investment time period, which has infinitesimal length dt. So it ends, an instant of time after that, right? So this is the instantaneous forward rate. There are models like the LIBOR market model that use the simple forward over a finite period, but right now we're talking about infinitesimal period. So the limit of the forward rate when both arguments are the same is the short rate, of course. And the discount factor is connected to the instantaneous forward by this expression. And note that unlike the previous expression we looked at, there's no expectation here, right? So in other words, if we know in a short rate model, today is the time t small and we know the short rate, then the left side and the right side are both deterministic and they're equal, right? So there's no expectation here because in the instantaneous forward rate, the expectation is already taken. Any questions so far? Okay, I wanted to thank everybody for your patience because I know that for probably everyone here, this is very basic, quant finance 101, but I need to set the stage for introducing the models, and please bear with me. We're going to get to the interesting stuff very soon. All right, so now let's consider the Hull-White model, right? So, that's the one of the earliest, in fact, the earliest short rate model, arbitrage-free short rate model developed. So this model is given by this expression, right, where A is the speed of mean reversion, theta is the time-dependent target of mean reversion, sigma is the model volatility, which is also time-dependent, and dw are the increments of the winner process. So model construction finds such theta that makes the model match the observed yield curve at t0, and that's what makes the model arbitrage-free. The mean reversion speed in Hull-White model is never assumed to depend on rate level because such modified model would not have an analytical solution. Right? So sometimes, very rarely, you see that the rate of mean reversion depends on time. That's actually not, really by far from being standard way to calibrate it. In fact, I haven't seen it really, among the practitioners, but sometimes you see papers who propose that, right? But it's never assumed to be dependent on rate level because making it dependent on rate level precludes the analytical solution, right? So it breaks the assumptions made in an analytical solution. And one of the good things about Hull-White model is that you can solve it analytically. So people don't do that because you lose the analytical solution unless you do that. But actually, we will soon see that that's exactly what autoencoder analysis of the historical yield curve shapes will tell us to do, right? So the autoencoder will analyze, that we trained on historical yield curve shapes, and we'll discover that to modify the model in order to represent curve shapes, historical curve shapes better, one of the things you should do is actually make mean reversion speed dependent on rate level, and we'll see exactly how. All right, so in order to proceed, we can rewrite the Hull-White model in an alternative deterministic shift form, which we'll call G++, following the notation introduced by Briga and Mercurio. So they propose to use ++ to signify the deterministic shift component in the model, right? So when you represent the short rate, is the sum of a deterministic time-dependent term that's used to make the model arbitrage-free and a time-homogeneous rest of the model. So for Hull-White, this is done, in equation 8. So short rate is equal to x of t plus phi of t, where phi is deterministic and x is stochastic. And x of t follows this stochastic equation, which has a simple mean reversion term with constant rate of mean reversion plus the volatility, right? With the initial condition of x equals 0 at model evaluation. So I emphasize this is not a different model, right? So this is a different way to write down the same model. And the reason we did that is because then it's very easy to see that the short rate, if no random shocks occur after time ti, right? So imagine that there is a sequence of times ti, right, from 0 to infinity, right? So there's a sequence of model times. And imagine that random shocks occurred in these times from up to ti minus 1, but ti was the last, up to ti, but ti was the last shock. And after that, there are no shocks. In this case, the short rate will converge to phi of t exponentially, right? So it will be whatever its initial deviation was, times the exponent, which depends on time, right? So the terms that depend on time here is phi of t. And this term is exactly exponential in t, right? Because that one does not depend. So, I'm sorry, what did I do? I didn't do anything good here. So let me just go back here. Okay, so we're back where we're supposed to be. Right, okay, so the trajectory of R in the absence of random shocks after a certain time will be exponential convergence to phi. Okay, so now let's think about the instantaneous forward rate. Well, it turns out that up to convexity correction, forward curve shape, actually not just in the G++ form of model, but generally, is the equilibrium trajectory of the short rate, right? So in other words, imagine that you have no volatility, right? Can you see me on camera? Because I'm sharing the screen and I'm not sure.
Yes.
Okay, right. So you have the trajectory for the short rate, right? And imagine that there is no volatility. So in this case, this short rate will travel along this trajectory. And when it gets to time t capital, that will exactly be the forward rate. Because there is no volatility, and there is also, we know that FRAs are martingales, and basically this forward rate is the rate for a forward rate agreement for the infinitesimal investment period. So given that FRA prices are martingales, right, or semi-martingales, and given that there is no volatility, the forward rate will be actually the trajectory of the short rate. Okay, now, of course, when there is volatility, that's not exactly the case because there is convexity, right, nonlinear effects. And the correction to the forward rate compared to what it would be without volatility is quadratic in volatility, right, that's convexity. So the forward rate is equal to the exponential term plus phi of t plus something proportional to the square of volatility, right? And even though you can calculate this term by various ways, and in fact, it's even analytical in the Holloway model, you can calculate it, when the model does not have an analytical solution. Holloway model does, right? But Autoencoder market models that we will build do not. You can calculate these terms by, expansion. You can calculate them by iterative procedure. But here, because we're talking about stylized behaviors, we're simply going to ignore it. In fact, it's not such a huge error for normal markets because typically this, convexity correction is not actually huge, especially compared to autoencoder error, right? So you can simply sweep it under the carpet and say that you absorb it into phi. So we're just going to ignore it for the moment, but so of course I don't recommend ignoring it in practical use of the model. But it's very, it's very helpful to ignore it here because then a lot of the relationships here will become more evident and without any complex math. All right, so now let's come back to this model, right? So this is a drawing of the Holloway model of these trajectories, right, which are basically both trajectories of the short rate and also the forward rate up to the convexity correction. So this line is phi, right, phi of t. Imagine that you're here in the beginning at t I minus 1, right? And now at t I minus 1, this shock occurs that at time t I makes the short rate take one of these 5 possible values. Okay, so from there, the short rate, again, in the absence of any future random shocks, will follow this trajectory, right? And in the Holloway model, this trajectory is this line, phi, plus an exponentially decaying term. What it means is that if you're above, then your slope is decreasing. If you're below, your slope is increasing, right? It's always the same curvature, right? Or rather, it's a curvature of the exponent, right? So it's the same rule for the curvature, right? It does not really have any room to, for fine tuning of, different curvature for different buckets. So this is actually incredibly crude assumption, right? So when you look at the, it's actually quite remarkable, and this is something that bothered me, for quite some time. I even mentioned it in my book, back in 2014, right? So 8 years ago. That for some reason, basically quants spend a lot of time modeling volatility, but really not a lot of time modeling, or thinking about mean reversion. And that's probably because when you're dealing with things like derivatives pricing, when time horizons are short, then volatility is more important than the drift, right? Because the square root versus the drift being linear. And you can just put something simple for the drift or mean reversion, and that's going to be good enough, right? But now we're using models for 30-year time horizons, even longer. We price complex portfolios, so exposures over very long time periods, and over these time periods, actually drift is as important as volatility, and sometimes even more important for very long time periods. And so we really should not be, we should be paying as much attention to the drift or the mean reversion term is the attention that we devote to volatility terms. And that's what we're trying to do here, right? So when you look at the Hull and White model, they say, well, it's reasonable, constant speed of mean reversion, right? But now we're looking here and say, hold on a second, right? So, basically this constant speed of mean reversion results in a very crude parametric form for the shape of the curve, right? So, later in the second session today, we'll be talking about Nelson-Siegel, which has 4 parameters, right? And Nelson-Siegel-Svensson that has 6, right? So here there are 2 parameters, the initial deviation and the speed of mean reversion. So that's, not a lot of parameters. And also we're not using these parameters in an optimal way, right? Because it's just, basically a very simple crude formula. So not a very good model, right? And you can do better, right? So no single parameter form can fit historical curve shapes perfectly, but some forms will do a better job than others. And the exponential curve form produced by the Hull and White model curve family, right, which is a 2-parameter form, is not optimal. For example, it fails to capture the dependence of curvature on rate level, and the poor fit can be traced to using the constant speed of mean reversion in order to solve this D analytically, right? So in other words, the reason it fails to capture the curve behavior on the dependence of curve behavior on rate level is because it's always the same speed of mean reversion, right? And in reality, it's not. So what we're going to do is to use the autoencoder to produce the optimal mapping of curve shapes into one-dimensional latent space, right? Because why one-dimensional? Because we started from building a one-factor autoencoder market model. And even if we cannot perfectly map, well, actually not even perfectly, but it's not obviously great when you're trying to fit all of the possible curve shapes with a single parameter. Well, but at least you can do better than this crude form, right? So in other words, a single parameter will not give you a good fit either way, but you can do better than what the standard assumption is of constant mean reversion. So that's the benefit that we're trying to obtain here, right? So we use the autoencoder to find the best way to pack or compress curve shapes into one-dimensional latent space, and then we're going to write the model using this latent space. So that's the promise. All right, so we can do that, as it turns out, without interfering with the choice of volatility term. And it works, don't touch it. That's kind of the philosophy, right? So in other words, we could also say, well, we're going to redo the volatility term, but when you start from the model, right, and you only change the drift, actually, it's kind of, I think it's an easier transition. It's kind of a more familiar model behavior. So what we're going to do is to mess with the drift term in the Hull and White model, but not with the volatility term, right? And that will be our normal one-factor short right IM. So that's not the only choice. In fact, you can also change the volatility term, and you can, in fact, just work in latent space. But this approach that I'm taking here is one of the possible ways to go. The advantage of it is that, especially for very short time horizon, the model is really the Hull and White model, right? And it's only for longer time horizons, so for like larger range of variation of the interest rates, that you start noticing the difference. And that's by intention, right? Because the key to model adoption is to not to basically have something very familiar and popular, right? So I intentionally designed the model to make a limited change to the standard model, right, to the classical model. And actually, this will be the same approach will be taken for all of the other models, right? So what is the minimal change you can make to the model to incorporate the autoencoder and improve the mapping of the yield curves to what the model predicts, historical yield curves to what the model predicts? All right, so how do we do that? Well, very simple, actually. So let f hat, right, be a family of instantaneous forward curve shapes produced by the autoencoder and parameterized by the short rate. Because given that everything depends on one variable, we can say that our latent variable, without loss of generality, we can say that our latent variable is a short rate, right? And in fact, it's of course not so latent, you can observe it. But if we're going to work with something, why not work with something observable? It makes it easier. Up to the convexity correction, the short rate drift is simply the partial derivative of this. We're going to basically make model drift the partial derivative of this f hat with respect to maturity, right? Now, in reality, in order to produce the curve shapes that we want, we need to also include the convexity correction, right? So in order for us to make the forward rates, in order for the forward rates predicted by the model to be this f hat family of rates, the drift has to take into, it has to also have the convexity term, right? So the term proportional to square of volatility. But during this workshop, again, to make sure that we don't fill the whole page with formulas, right? So actually we can ignore it because it's a small correction. There are all kinds of ways to take it into account. And given that autoencoder is actually not, especially in one dimension, autoencoder is anything but precise, right? It just captures kind of the broad, broad features of rate, like saying, well, if your short rate is high enough, right, the curve will become inverted. This type of broad features. So in fact, you really would not damage the quality of the model by simply ignoring it, but I have it there just because it exists. So the SDE is given, now it's very familiar, right? So the same G++ form of the Hollow-White model. So however, here instead of the meter version, we have this term where this mu hat is obtained is the solution of this equation, right? Where there's an appropriate convexity term here that I abbreviated, and it will then produce the curve shapes that the autoencoder predicts. The rest is the same as in the Hollow-White model. Okay, so that's a pretty crucial point because we'll use a very similar trick for all of the other models. Are there any questions?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, good. Right. All right. So excellent. I'm doing very well. No questions. Everything is super clear, or not clear at all, as the case may be. All right. So now, before we go to two-factor models, right, and note on fitting the volatility smile. So it may seem tempting to replace the normal volatility with Dupire-like calibration of volatility dependence on rate level to make the model even better, right? However, the step will not have a desired effect, right? Because a model like that, we all, are practitioners, right? So you don't see a lot, as we all know, right? You don't see a lot of Dupire, Dupire local volatility, Dupire, calibration, or local stochastic volatility is used for things like equity, for things like FX, right? Not so much for interest rates, right? And the reason is because the local volatility model, like Dupire-like calibration for the interest rates, may fit superficially the volatility surface well, right? Or at least a slice from it, right? But it will not have good performance in any other respect, right? So that's the key thing there. So you may, fit basically some selected subset of European options, right? But the model will actually have unstable hedges and so forth. And that's because the root cause of skew and smile for the interest rates is stochastic volatility, not, the level dependent volatility. So the proper modeling of interest rate smile and skew, volatility smile and skew, requires a Sabre-like approach where volatility is also stochastic. And you can do that, right? The proper way to do it is to build autoencoder market model counterpart to LMM Sabre, right? So the model in which there is a, basically a sequence of Sabre models for each maturity that's stitched together into a single term structure model. And this, unfortunately, is not something we can do today. It's a lot more complex, model building there, and we don't have time for it in this workshop. But what we will not be doing is saying, well, let's now use autoencoder to fit the volatility smile, right? Once you use the autoencoder on the volatility, the way to do it is to make the volatility stochastic as opposed to make it rate dependent in a kind of a sophisticated Dupire-like way. However, this being said, right? So reflecting volatility dependence on rate level in broad terms, like using CV term, right? So maybe you don't want normal, you want square root, right? Or shifted square root. You might maybe perhaps even shifted log normal, right? So that is actually advisable. And the model, in fact, as we discussed before, I didn't mess with the volatility term, only with the drift term. So whatever you can do with any classical one-factor short rate model, you can also do with this model, right? Because we're only using the autoencoder to change the drift term, but not the volatility term. All right, and now we're ready to go to two-factor short rate models. Okay, so what's a two-factor short rate model? So the two-factor short rate model still models the short rate. And by the way, modeling the short rate is one way to save yourself pages and pages of complex math, because if you say that you're going to just model the short rate, then these no arbitrage conditions that we were talking about before, that really the main kind of complication of whole curve models that we'll discuss a little bit later, once you model the short rate, you don't have to worry about it because it's your friend, not your enemy, right? So when you model the whole curve, and then it turns out like you model what the curve does, right? And I say, there's there's arbitrage, right? So it's your enemy, right? You have to fight it to make the curve change, arbitrage-free. For the short rate model, this is your friend because that's what allows you to calculate everything else, including the shape of the curve. Once you specify the probability density or stochastic differential equation for the short rate, the no arbitrage condition is your friend because that's how you calculate the rest, right? So we don't have to worry about making it, arbitrage-free because it's automatically is arbitrage-free. And by adding a second stochastic driver to the same short rate, the models acquire one more state variable. And unlike one-factor short rate models, now two-factor short rate models, first of all, they don't have 100% correlation between interest rates of different maturities. And they can also represent more diverse curve shapes, right? So they can represent not only one way to move the curve, but actually, two ways to move the curve, right? At each point in time. All right, so the two-factor Holm-White model, again, is the granddaddy of all two-factor models. In fact, of course, the extension to anything, things other than normal is trivial here. So it was originally postulated, and actually, it's very important to remember about this original definition because it makes it clear what the objective is, right? So it was specified as the mean reverting normal process with the mean reversion target is also stochastic and is also a normal mean reverting process. And for the second process, the mean reversion target is constant, right? So it was, with normal, you can basically add and remove constants here. So it's kind of the second thing is actually reverting to zero, right? But, for kind of, clarity or model, for making sense of the model, it would be more helpful to make it revert to a constant level, right? So essentially what Hollow-White two-factor Hollow-White model does, it says long-term rates revert to a constant level and short rates reverts to that stochastic level, right? So there are two mean reversion speeds. There are two volatilities. There are two winner, there's a correlated winner process with the correlation matrix rho, right? So, and as before, theta is set such that the model matches the initial yield curve. And I took some liberty with the parameters just to make it more consistent with modern notation. So theta is defined differently in the original paper. Right, now the two-factor Hollow-White model can be specified by an alternative symmetric set of equations proposed in Briga and Mercurio and known as G2++. And this form is symmetrical, right? So it's actually easier for the analytical solution, but it kind of obscures the meaning a little bit. Because what it does now is that there are short rate is represented as the sum of two stochastic factors in a constant deterministic shift. The two factors are both mean reverting to zero with the constant but different mean reversion speeds and two separate time-dependent volatilities. When calibrating, usually they're made proportional to the same time dependence with different ways. So there are two mean reversion speeds. There are two, stochastic drivers, two state variables, and phi is also calculated to match today's yield curve. So just like before, G2++ is a different way to write down the Hollow-White model, not a different model. So similar to the one-factor case, if no random shocks perturb the short rate after the time ti, the difference between equilibrium short rate trajectory and phi decays is the sum of two exponents, right? So you have one exponent, second exponent, and something that's deterministic but depends on time. So the time dependence here is pure exponential because the multiplier does not depend on t, right? So it's two exponents as a function of time plus some dependence that does not change, right? So the two state variables, right? By convention, the state variable with slow reversion, which by convention is x1, normally primarily contributes to the parallel shift. Right, because essentially, if there is a small a, right, then it will basically shift the entire trajectory, for a very long time. In the state variable with fast reversion, primarily contributes to the tilt because it only moves the start of the curve, but not the end of the curve. So one of them is sort of the parallel shift, and the other one is sort of like the tilt. Right? Or the combination rather of parallel shift and the tilt that moves the initial rates but not the later rates. Okay. Now the two exponential terms in two-factor Hollow-White model can fit better, historical curve shapes better than the single exponential term in the one-factor Hello-White model. But of course, not as well as the autoencoder with 2 latent variables trained to historical data, because again, we have more parameters to work with here. Now there are 5 parameters, right? So there's well, this is actually not a free parameter because sorry, there are 4. Well, there are 4 parameters because this is something that's fixed to prevent arbitrage relative to the initial yield curve. So we have 2 multipliers and 2 mean reversion rates, right? And 2 of them are fixed once you calibrate the model, and these 2, x1 and x2, right, are basically the state variables that we can make that we can change to reflect. Somebody is off mute. Can you put mute, please? Okay, thank you. So so there are essentially, this is a 2-dimensional quote unquote latent space. This is a classical model because there are 5 parameters here plus phi, but once the model is constructed and is being used, you don't change anything other than x1 and x2, right? So this is a rigid form. Autoencoder can do better because it's free from this rigid requirement that we just work with exponents with constant constant a1 and a2. Okay, so how do we extend G2++ specification of the 2-factor Hello-White model to become the autoencoder market model? Okay, well, in order to do this without changing the volatility term, we need, or at least the easiest way to do it rather, to have an additive property of the autoencoder, right? And additive property of the encoder means that we work with the family autoencoders such that the instantaneous forward rate is the sum of 2 terms, one which depends on one latent variable and the other one on the other latent variable. So consider the average shape of the yield curve over the historical sample, right? So there's so rates go up, rates go down. You have your history of, let's say, 30 years. So there's a curve shape that's the average curve shape, average, or rather, the center of gravity in latent space. Remember the ellipses that we've been looking about yesterday, and we'll look again today. So the center of gravity in latent space of the encoded historical data. Linear deviation from that curve shape is always separable, right? Because it's a linear term, is separable. So it's only violated by cross terms, and we can actually specifically target this form of encoded curve by penalizing for cross terms. But fortunately, the existing autoencoder in 2 dimensions that we have is already pretty close to this, right? Because yesterday and now this will make sense, like that's the reason we're doing it. So yesterday we were looking at the difference between going along the diagonal of the ellipse versus going along the major and minor axis. And so major axis plus minor axis was the dashed line, and the diagonal was a solid line, right? And in most cases, they almost overlap. So the autoencoder that we just naturally get by optimizing the regular loss function is actually already has pretty small cross terms. So we're not going to really worry about it then. But if that's not the case, then we can actually specifically penalize for cross terms and make it even better, right? In this case, the 2-factor short rate autoencoder market model is very similar to 1-factor, right? So here again, we have the drift. Actually, I apologize that this is actually missing hat, right? So let me just make a note of that, right? So this should be mu hat. I'll correct it before posting the slides, right? So dx1 and dx2 is mu hat, for tx1, mu hat of tx2, right? And this each mu hat is equal to the partial derivative of the of this fi in the bottom. Actually, sorry, and the index is missing. I guess I copied it. Yeah, my apologies. Actually, this slide has a couple of typos in the formula, right? So it should be fi here in the bottom as well. So it's a partial derivative of this one component of that encoder, with respect to time. And as before, there's also the convexity term that we're going to ignore here for the exposition purposes, but you can easily take it into account. So likewise, we made some pretty limited change to the standard 2-factor Hello-White And as a result of the change, it now represents historical shapes of the yield curve much better. You can evidence it by generating yield curves in the model and then testing how well they correspond to historical curve shapes. All right. Any questions about short rate models, one factor, two factor, before we go to whole curve models and then to examples and look at autoencoders? Questions?
Not yet.
All right. Okay, so whole curve models, right? So we now will turn our attention to the interest rate models that specify the entire yield curve rather than the short rate, right? So forward rate models, including AGM and LMM, parameterize forward rates for fixed borrowing time intervals that do not advance with model time t. And risk-neutral curve basis models, including arbitrage-free Nelson-Siegel, in factor AGM, parameterize rates with constant maturity length whose maturity dates advance with model time t. Right, so the difference between these two model types is that if you have forward rates for fixed borrowing time period, right, and then your model time advances, the first model category, like AGM, LMM, right, so their state variable stays the same. Eventually, the model time reaches it, and then the state variable is retired, and the next one, becomes the first, right? So the state variables have limited time span, right, and new ones are added at the end. So curve basis models, what they attempt to do is to describe their state variables are rates with constant maturity with respect to model time. So as the model time advances, the maturity date also advances. So the whole thing kind of moves in parallel, and these state variables are never retired. However, it turns out, and again, due to the fact that we only have 1 hour for risk-neutral models, I cannot go into too much detail. But just the overall, but the point I wanted to make just before focusing on a single model type that we will have time to discuss today, is that this curve basis models, the derivation of this curve basis model is still, rooted, it basically starts from instantaneous forward rates, right? And I'll talk a little bit more actually about how this works in the second session, because these models are a lot more prominent in the real world measure. But these models essentially, and especially the recent paper by Lashenko and Goncharov shows how to start from AGM and essentially derive arbitrage-free Nelson-Siegel and its extensions. So we will focus. So because these models, it basically, if you look at their foundation, right, they're still starting from the forward rate. We're just going to focus on the forward rate models today. And the math that's released to Autoencoders is actually not that different between AGM and LMM, right? So AGM is the model for continuous forward rate, and LMM is the model for the simple forward rate. As I mentioned yesterday, it's called the LIBOR market model, but it will outlive the LIBOR because even when there is no LIBOR, you still want the model, you still need the model for the simple forward rate with constant, finite tenor. So we'll look at the AGM, but LMM will be very similar. So, what really the main difference between these models, right, is not actually it's more illuminating to think about the difference between these models is the distinction between parameterizing curve shocks and parameterizing the curve itself, right? So for AGM and LMM parameterize curve shocks, arbitrage-free Nelson-Siegel and factor AGM parameterize the curve. Right, and then you have to do a lot of work to make sure that this is arbitrage-free, more work than for the forward rate models. And among the forward rate models, AGM specifies the instantaneous forward rates, and LMM specifies the finite tenor rates. So we'll build out the Encoder market model extension or counterpart to Gaussian AGM, but the same approach can be used for these other model types, right, with some modifications. Right, so Gaussian AGM model, which is actually the first because the first arbitrage-free model for the forward curve, specifies the following stochastic differential equation for the forward rate curve evolution, where there's k stochastic drivers, each having this volatility that depends on T small and T capital as well. Right, and the drift term is actually the convexity, right? So if not for the convexity, there would be no drift term. So drift term is just pure convexity, is proportional to sigma squared. And of course, you can immediately see that it lacks the mean reversion component familiar from the short rate models, and it becomes zero when volatility is zero, So now the question is, how is it possible? Because if you don't have mean reversion, you actually don't. If you don't have mean reversion, you don't. You basically, if you don't have mean reversion, your rates will go to plus infinity, minus infinity, right? So interest rates move in a finite range, and mean reversion makes it so in the model. Well, the reason is that AGM actually does have mean reversion, but it captures it in a different way. So in short rate models, mean reversion is specified as the short rate drift. In forward rate models, the random shocks at time t small affect forward rate for all maturities t capital at the same time. In mean reversion is specified as the dependence of volatility or reduced volatility for distant maturities, right? So sigma k of t small and t capital becomes smaller with longer, with t capital maturity longer into the future. So what happens is that you bump the entire curve, right? But you bump the beginning more than the end. And this is the same as mean reversion, because mean reversion tells you that if you have a shock to the short rate, eventually it will dissipate. It will be no longer felt for very distant time. Here you bump the entire curve, but you bump it more in the beginning and less at the end. So you achieve mean reversion by simply making sigma decreasing with t capital increasing. So mean reversion is still there, just captured in a different way. And the equivalence of the two ways to specify mean reversion can be illustrated by the special case of one-factor Gaussian AGM, which is equivalent to the Hallan-White model if we use this particular form of volatility, right, which is exponential decay. And this factor in its exponential decay is the same as the Hallan-White model mean reversion speed, right? So the properties of AGM are determined by its volatility basis, right? So the dependence of volatility on maturity. And that basis determines not only the volatility, in other words, what in short rate models is split between the drift and the volatility in the AGM model is part of volatility, right? It's essentially the dependence on T small you can think of is what becomes the volatility in the short rate model, and dependence on T capital is what becomes the drift in the short rate model. And so, okay, now how do we use autoencoders with that? Well, and that, by the way, is the last slide, right, before we go to examples, right? So, well, to build two-factor IMM counterpart to AGM, but we derive the volatility basis from curve transformations in the vicinity of the point in latent space, into which the previous curve is mapped by the encoder. So imagine that today's curve encodes into this point in latent space. You can move in, if you have two-dimensional autoencoder, two-dimensional latent space, you can move along the main axis or the principal axis or the minor axis, minor axis of the ellipse. So one of them will produce one family of shifts. The other direction produce the second family of shifts. So we can take the shifts and use it as sigma, right? So in other words, we make sigma depend on T capital the same way as the shifts depend on maturity. And what this will do is ensure that when you have bumps to the curve in the AGM or LMM model, these bumps are similar to historical changes of the curve starting from that point, instead of being some arbitrary parametric form, which is usually crude and oversimplified like the exponent. So again, given a certain number of random shocks, you are able to improve, use it best, whatever dimension of model you have, whatever number of factors you have, use them better by using the autoencoder to determine what the shifts should be. If you have two random shocks, right, you can use the autoencoder to determine what these two shifts should be, as opposed to just postulating that they're exponential. And furthermore, is an optional step, right? If in only, you don't need to do it if you don't have to do backward induction, you don't have early exercise. But if you do, then you can also use the same latent space as the basis for MC projection. Because normally with American Monte Carlo, you either project on the price of the underlying, right? So you project the price of the option on the price of the underlying. You're essentially making an approximation that option price is deterministic function of the underlying, and that's not always a good approximation. Or you're letting the American Monte Carlo method figure out using something like PCA or nonlinear PCA, what is the best way to project among the infinite dimensional state space of AGM, or finite but very high dimensional state space of LMM. Because in AGM there is infinite number of state variables, each point on a curve. And in LMM, there is a finite but large number because every forward rate is a state variable. So you can build latent space for the curve shapes and then map the curve into this latent space and do American Monte Carlo in latent space. So that's the second way that you can use Autoencoder for the with AGM or LMM. You can use the latent space as the basis for Monte Carlo, and again, autoencoder trading will assure that's the optimal basis. All right, so with that, I think it's the last slide. Yeah, so after the references, and with that, again, if there are no questions, I wanted to go and go back to some examples, and then we can examine what shapes we get from the autoencoder, and what it means for the models when we take these exponential simple forms and replace them with autoencoded curve shapes. Right. So let me stop sharing for the moment, and I will go to examples. All right. So let me just go back here to this. Right. So let's look at the at a few examples here and run them. Okay, 1 second. Let me just try to share again. Hopefully it will work. Right. Okay. Okay, so I think that's the red screen, I think. Okay, do you see the PyCharm, the Python window? Okay, perfect. All right, so let me do this, right? So as I promised, some fun, right? And by the way, just to set the stage for this next, right? So I know that risk-neutral models are of more interest, right? So even though there is increasing importance of real-world models recently, but still risk-neutral models rule. So the session on real-world models will be a little bit shorter, and I will use the time from the second hour to go through more examples. So right now, we have just a few minutes left in this hour. So let me perhaps start from, running a couple of simple things and reviewing a couple of simple things. And then we will begin the second hour after the 5-minute coffee break. We'll begin the second hour from reviewing some more examples. And then we go to the real world models. And that will conclude eventually the session after the next hour. All right, so let me do the following. First of all, I promised yesterday that we're going to have some fun with MNIST, right? So MNIST is the database of handwritten digits. And as I mentioned yesterday, right? So so this is the code for the MNIST autoencoder. So I'm going to run it, right? And I'm going to run it in a very particular way, right? So typically, in order to win competitions, and the competitions from MNIST is a standard way for machine learning algorithms to compete in recognizing handwritten digits. So the way to win MNIST recognition competition is to have a lot more advanced neural network, a lot more high-dimensional latent space. But our objective here is to by the way, what happened here? Why did it finish running? But I don't still see the. Hold on a second. I should make sure that as I'm talking, I'm actually running it. And so far, for some reason, I don't see the. Actually, no, I do already. Wait. Did I just generate it? Okay, 1 second. So let me just run the other report. Oh, I see. Okay, so I didn't run that report. Let me just start running that report. In the meantime, we can talk about MNIST, right? Okay, so do you see the report with the chart?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Right. So before we encode the yield curve, that's what I promised to show yesterday, right? So the question is like, well, how powerful is the two-dimensional latent space, right? In other words, can we really encode all of the possible curve shapes in two-dimensional latent space accurately and so forth? Well, there are 10 digits, right? They're basically handwritten in various ways. right? And what happens here is that we ran this example is that we run training for about 5 minutes. I don't want to spend the next hour in 5-minute intervals running stuff, right? But it took about 5 minutes to run, and that's actually a pretty standard example. You can find a lot of tutorials. But what we did is that instead of compressing to high-dimensional latent space, we compressed to 2-dimensional latent space. So we took essentially all digits, right? And we compressed all of it's not just the digits, right? It's not just the numbers. It's all of the possible ways to write them and compress in 2 dimensions, right? And that's something I had on the slide, but now we actually generated it. So what happens is that these digits are decoded from random points in latent space. With variational autoencoder, we generated the distribution in latent space of the training data for the digits. That is essentially, close to standard normal, right? So basically, this is centered and it has a size of around 1. And then we took random points in latent space, right? So we, instead of taking normally in competitions, what you do is that you encode the digit in a training set, right? And then see if you recognize it back. But now we discard the labels. We just want to generate digits, right? Just, for the model, again, we don't want to say, hey, this yield curve looks like similar to the yield curve, from whatever this period, right? This maybe economists should think about it. But, if we're quants, right, we don't care about yield curves being recognized and labeled, right? We just want to generate an accurate probability distribution of them. So this is the generated digits, right? So computer, our machine learning wrote these digits. Okay, now this is again, so this is a very minimal training, takes about 5 minutes. And this is 2-dimensional latent space, so there's a limitation to it. But this is 8. This is 9, this is 2, right? And this is, you see, this is interesting, right? You see that this is kind of like 6, but also like 0, right? So you can think of it as 6, but then, so this point is in the middle between the cluster of 6 and the cluster of zeros, right? This point is in the middle of between 9 and 1. So what it does is that it reproduces the digits that are clear. And also it produces smooth transitions between the digits, and it never decodes anything crazy, right? So no digits here are unrecognizable, right? So some of them are kind of, you can see that they're transitions, right? But all of these digits make sense. What would happen if we didn't have the Kullback-Leibler divergence is that the latent space would be, the clusters in latent space would be very far from each other. And if we then decoded random points in latent space, we'd get all kinds of crazy wiggles, right? So that's why we need variational autoencoder or another type of regularizer that does the same thing, right? So these are the, and again, so this is these are the encoded digits, right? So you start from what's digit on the left and you end up with a digit on the right. So again, so you encode the curve, you decode the curve, or you encode the digit, you decode the digit. Well, it was 8 on the left and it's 8 on the right, right? And it looks similar, right? This 9, it's rotated a little bit, right? So essentially, you see that this is what 2-dimensional latent space does for digits. Okay, now rhetorical question, right? Try to do it with the exponents, right? So you can see, there is no way that you can think of a parametric form that will do this, right? There's no way that you can say, well, hey, I have 700 bits here. I'm going to come up with a parametric formula that will have 2 parameters and will encode all of this digit shapes accurately and never produce with any of these 2 various parameters, never produce anything crazy. So you can see how much better autoencoder is for recognizing patterns in historical, or in this case, in input data, and then compressing it into very low dimensional space. And it does exactly the same thing for us in interest rates. And this is why when you normally would think that in order to describe some curve behavior, you need, let's say, 3 or 4 factor model, but actually autoencoder with 2 factors or 2 latent variables can do just as well, just because it's so powerful. So that's the message that I wanted to kind of deliver here, right? And now the hour is up, so we'll take a 5-minute break, and after the break we'll look at more examples, and maybe I'll run them during the break, so we don't have time to wait. And then after about 15 minutes of looking at the examples, we go to the real world models, and this will conclude the workshop. All right, so 5-minute break. I'm going to turn off the video, but if there are any questions, I'll answer them right after the break. So if you can think of some, please put them in the chat. All right, 5-minute break. All right, so we're back. This is Alexander Sokol, and this is the fourth and final session of the workshop on autoencoder market models for the interest rates. Before we go into the real-world models, which is the topic of this session, I would like to continue going through the examples. And during the coffee break, I actually ran a few more things that I'd like to review. Because today, with the benefit of the earlier session, now that we know how autoencoders will be used in models, we will be able to see exactly what the changes are that they will bring about when we replace the simple exponential forms in short rate models or the standard parameterization of volatility in forward rate models, if we replace these by what's inspired or derived from the autoencoder. Now, one more thing I wanted to do, and I just want to make sure that everybody can see my screen with the report.
Yes,
you do?
All
Okay.
good.
Right. And still see it, right? Okay. Right. I mentioned that I could run this MNIST example, right? So now it's the example we autoencode handwritten digits into two-dimensional latent space without KLD, again, to stress the point that regularization and continuity are extremely important, and variational autoencoder, as opposed to regular autoencoder based on, without the random sampling. So variational autoencoder does it very well, and that's not the only way to achieve regularity, but it's one very good way to achieve regularity, and you either need that or another way to achieve regularity. So this is the example of what happens with these digits if you don't try to achieve regularity, right? So that's how the latent space looks like. So you can see it's more spread out, right? It goes all the way to to 15 so here, and also it has more gaps, right? So it's more spread out, it has more gaps. And as a result, what happens here, that's what happens if you decode from random points. Is it because the autoencoder is bad, right? No, it's not, because when you decode the digits, right? So that's still pretty good, right? So that's the input, that's the output, right? That's the input, that's the output. So the difference here is that regular autoencoder is not a generative model, or is a bad generative model, right? So generative model is the machine learning model that can generate new data. We need, when we use autoencoder in interest rate model construction, we need to be able to generate new data, new curves. So regular autoencoder can encode this data, right? And it does it just about the same as in the previous example. But what they cannot do is produce new data, right? So when you try to make it produce new data, when you say, well, I'm going to not just encode something to a point in latent space and then decode the same point and see how well it does, right? But I'm just going to randomly take a point in latent space and decode it, that you get this garbage, right? And that's exactly the difference here. So this versus the previous example where this generated digits, 1 second, let me just show you, I probably still have it somewhere here, one moment. Okay. Right. So you see, these look about the same. So that, versus that, right? In fact, yeah, so that versus that. Not much difference, right? But this versus that, right? So you see, no KLD term, regular autoencoder, KLD term, variational autoencoder. That's what variational autoencoder does, and that's why it's really important that we use it for the interest rates as well. Any questions about this part? All right. So, oh yeah, there's a question. Would it be possible to access the Scratch version of the repo? Yeah, so there was no the code I was using is unfortunately it says commercial software in this code, and also it has commercial data as far as interest rates. I am actually working on a GitHub repo to go with the paper. That will soon come out. So unfortunately for the workshop today, there is no GitHub repo to run it, but I'm working on it, and I hope with the paper to provide one or soon after the paper comes out. So once it's available, we can maybe notify everybody who signed up that it's available. So, but thank you for the question. Certainly, I know how important it is to have GitHub. It just, this was done using commercial software, and there's not something I can put on GitHub. All right, so now let's go to the curves, right? So which is our topic, right? Not digits. All right, so I ran a few things, right? And they all hopefully finished now, right? And so let's do a couple of things here. So first of all, we already looked at the default, two-dimensional mapping, right? So I'll open it again. So that's something we looked at yesterday, right? So now I ran more currencies. Right. So again, to recap, right? So we look at let's say let's say pick a currency, right? USD. Okay. So these are the historical curves for USD. This is the decoded curves, right? So you put them into Autoencoder, you decode them back. They look close enough, just like the digits look close enough. Better than you can do with the same number of parameters, but without the Autoencoder by trying to guess a parametric form. This is what happens when you go around the ellipse of two standard deviations. So essentially, this is a set of curves you obtain by traveling around the perimeter of the ellipse that encloses 95% of the data. Very useful way to see exactly what shapes are there. This is how well we do in decoding, right? So that kind of indicates how much use we had of other currencies. In other words, how much better our Autoencoder became by combining, by adding other currency, right? So if you can perfectly predict the currency, then what it means is that you really don't probably need other currencies, right? So here you can see you cannot perfectly predict the currencies. So here you predict USD, right? So for this data you predict USD. These are the dates, right? So in this time period, it can recognize this as a distinctly US curve. For other time periods, it does not, right? So this is the kind of the confusion matrix between currencies, put it this way, right? So this is the latent space, right? So that's the minor axis. This is the major axis, right? So major axis is parallel shift. Minor axis is the kind of a tilt with convexity, right? So this is how much the cross term is, right? So solid line is with the cross term. In other words, the full Autoencoder. Dash line is when you represent it as the sum of the function of one latent variable and the function of the other latent variable. So you can see it's close enough, which means that we can take this Autoencoder and use it in two-factor short rate Autoencoder market model. Now, you can do the opposite, right? You can start from parallel shift and see what you do in latent space, right? So fine, right? So if you do parallel shift, you move along this direction in latent space. If you do a tilt around 15-year point, you'll go in the approximately perpendicular direction, exactly what you'd expect. And if you do curvature, it's somewhere between the two, right? So curvature is encoded as kind of, because again, so we have three ways to shift the curve and only two variables. So it's something in the middle, right? So you can see this, how, so this basically this chart kind of is a good kind of fingerprint, can find a criminal by the fingerprint, right? So you can look at this and say, I know which currency it is, right? And this is fingerprint, right? So if there are two currencies with similar fingerprints, then they're related, right? Or rather, they're similar, right? They have similar curve dynamics. It means that you can use them. There are uses for that, right? You can use perhaps as one is proxy for the other if there is not sufficient data, right? So that's the fingerprint, right? So it basically says, how the parallel shift, tilt, and curvature are related to each other. And there we go with the next currency. Okay, so now let's look at the one-dimensional Autoencoder, right? So one-dimensional Autoencoder is exactly where I promised that, we're not going to fit perfectly in one dimension, right? But we can fit better than the exponential form. This is a latent space, and this is what's encoded, right? So this is all currencies, right? So let's just look at one currency. Let's look at also at USD. Right. So these are the, hold on a second, is one-dimensional? No, sorry, my apologies, I opened two-dimensional, of course. In fact, I should have recognized it looking at latent space. Did I run it with one dimension? Hold on a second, why don't I not have, yes, Vera, you know what, did I not run it with one?
Svetlana, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah.
Yes, sure.
That's what I ran
you
it,
should
right?
have report for it if you ran it. Yeah. Maybe try to refresh by charm.
A second.
Reports directory.
Okay. Perhaps. Туди. 1D. One second. For some reason I don't. That's strange. Okay, let me just. So that's the name, right? D new. Okay, so just run it again. See what happens. Oh, wait a second. I need to train as well, right?
Okay. No, you don't need to train.
No, well, I changed the name though. So. Yeah. They just run training, right? See what happens here. By the way, you can just kind of see how fast it's training, right? So there are what 500 epochs here, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so it'll take a few minutes. Can you actually email it to me just in the interest of time if you have it, so we don't have to wait until it finishes? For some reason I don't have it here. I'm not sure why. Okay, and while Svetlana is sending me the report, let's just look at a couple of other things that we did run, right? So one of them is that what happens when you just have one hot here, right? So this is the report. You can still see the screen?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Right, so this is what happens when you only have one hot loss, right? Well, obviously your curve is completely crazy. In fact, this doesn't look like anything. Okay, but what's not crazy is the currency, right? So you perfectly recognize the currency. So this is the, so there are three terms here, right? So the curve reconstruction loss, how precisely you map the curve. The Kullback-Leibler divergence, which penalizes gaps in latent space, and also penalizes crazy, decoding of points, of random points between the points into which data was encoded. In a third term, which is cross entropy on recognition of the currency, right? This is the example of what happens if you make the cross entropy on recognition of the currency the largest term in loss, right? So in other words, it doesn't really do much for the curve. In latent space is completely crazy, but it always perfectly recognizes the currency, right? So this is the input is always the Danish kroner, and the output is always the Danish kroner. Well, not a big surprise you can do it, of course, right? But that's just kind of an illustration of what this thing does, right? Okay, now let's see what happens if we have only the Kullback-Leibler divergence term. Can anyone guess? Any takers? Okay, so we have the perfect circle, which is standard normal distribution, right? With that's a one standard deviation, right? Why? Because we ignore the curve reconstruction, we ignore the currency reconstruction. All we want is all of our data to be encoded into standard normal, and it is, right? So that's the Kullback-Leibler divergence's loss is 0. There's no Kullback-Leibler divergence from what comes out and the standard normal. And of course, the curve is crazy, and the currency is also not recognizable. In fact, it just randomly, makes weights of all of the other currencies, right? So that's what happens if you only have the Kullback-Leibler term. And of course, if you only have the reproduction term, then you do the same. You get the same things as we already looked at it before, so I will not show it again. So you get good curve shapes on the decoded data, but you get crazy curve shapes anywhere else. All right, and with that, let me just stop sharing for a second so I can get the one-dimensional report. Actually, let me first see if it's so it's already actually 300 epochs, so I could just wait a little bit. But let me just get it from the 1 second. Go to post sharing and get hopefully the file. Okay, perfect. All right, so I got the file, and hopefully soon in a few minutes we'll actually get this file generated, on the computer. All right, so this is one-dimensional latent space, and of course now we just can see that if there is one-dimensional latent space, so this is how the currencies are encoded, right? And this is of course, and there cannot really anything different about it. Encoded kind of the areas of latent space correspond to the level of the rates. Right, so the South African rand is at one end, Swiss franc and yen are at the other end, right? Everything else is in between. So you have one-dimensional latent space. You encode curve shapes. Your location in latent space, if you input data, corresponds to the level of the race. High race here, low race there, right? So no surprise. But as you see here, right? So, and this is for all currencies, right? So this is a latent, this is the input, and this is a latent space, 2 standard deviations, right? So basically, the curves on the right should enclose 95% of the data. And they do, right? Because there are only a few outliers here. So as you can see here, this looks very different from the assumption of Helm-White, actually CR, CR++, basically pretty much any one-factor short rate model. Because one-factor short rate models, they all have different volatility, but they all, however, have constant speed of mean reversion. In fact, the only exception is Black-Karasinsky, but not because Black and Karasinsky actually were thinking about the drift at the time. They're not, right? They just happen to choose the variable of the model to be the logarithm of the short rate. So they also assumed constant speed of mean reversion, but in the logarithm, right? So that makes actually, if you express it in terms of the rate as opposed to its logarithm, at log, then Black-Karasinsky, drift is different, right? But the reason is different is accidental, right? Not intentional. So what you can see here, right, is that this curve shape, even if the rate increases, it's still increasing in the beginning, but then it becomes decreasing, right? And there's something going on here where it becomes flatter at near zero rates. So at near zero rates, it's not as steep as when the rates are higher. And then when the rates become even higher, it eventually becomes inverted, but not across all maturities at the same time. So the autoencoder, having only one latent variable to play with, still does a lot more sophisticated job than a single exponential term, which basically makes the same crude assumption. And in fact, when you're looking at this, you can see how much better it is than the standard mean reversion assumption. In a standard mean reversion assumption, the lower the interest rate, the steeper it is, right? Because you think of basically you converge exponentially to the same level, right? So the lower you start, the faster it reverts, and the faster it reverts, the steeper the curve. So the Helm-White model, everybody focuses on the fact that it's bad for, it basically, well, before you say, well, the terrible arbitrage, negative rates. Well, now it's actually kind of became a good thing, right? It was a bad thing when you had negative rates. Now it's a good thing. Now the model is bad if it doesn't have negative rates because they occur, right? But it actually does it very badly because for very low or negative rates, the yield curve in Helm-White model is the steepest, right? Relative to its equilibrium shape, right? In the initial shape. And actually not what you want, because when you're in a liquidity trap, it's not steep at anything but steep, right? In fact, it's very flat. So the autoencoder with one dimension does something a lot better, right? So this is, and by the way, second thing is that you see it does, that's where in one dimension, actually the currency input, right? The cross entropy curve on the currency is actually the most helpful because you can see it does different things for different currencies, right? It's not the same for different currencies. So these are the curve shapes that occur if you try to use the autoencoder as opposed to a very crude parametric form of the standard short rate models or of the standard volatility structure in the forward rate models. This is much more sophisticated. It does a different thing at each rate level, right? For low rates, it does one thing. For high rates, it does another thing, right? So you see, and also it does different things for different currencies if you use one hot. And we have a way to construct one-factor short rate model, two-factor short rate model, or forward rate model that produces these historical shapes to the extent you can produce them, given your number of variables, 1 or 2, or 3. Of course, you can do more, right? So that is what I wanted to demonstrate. So actually, I'm glad that we couldn't see the reports yesterday because now that we can, interpret them better, knowing how they are used in arrays. Okay, so I'm going to answer the questions and then we'll go to real world. All right, so how much data would you need to feel confident enough to avoid the latent space? You're fairly sure you're spacing latent space. Yeah, I can confirm this from eyeball the non-racial analysis. Yeah. So excellent question actually. Yeah. So first answer, right, is that you definitely know. Well, first of all, yeah. So there are rigorous ways of doing it, which is basically the embargo period. There are other ways of doing it. First of all, for single currency, you definitely don't have enough data simply because there are very few currencies that experience every possible range. There are few currencies that had near zero rates or negative rates and then had like 15% rates, right? So most currencies were like in one segment. So you do need to combine, you do need to train to multi-currency data set. Which, by the way, one thing is we're probably out of time, but I wanted to show, but I just tell you, right? So if you don't have the currency name as input to the autoencoder, it still does pretty well actually, and it still places different currencies in different areas of latent space based on the shape, right? But this one does better. So you know that single currency data is not enough for a lot of currencies, the majority of currencies. I feel, based on a lot of analysis, that across all currencies, the history of swap rates, if you switch stitch library with OS, is sufficient. And how do you know it? Well, you know it by doing the same thing as we've been doing before. Let me just switch to the two-dimensional report, right? So then to the good one, right? So I think this is this. No, wait, is this one, right? So what you do is the following, right? So you start. I should go back 1 second. This is an excellent question, so I just answer it in detail, right? So what you do here is that this is a latent space, right? This is where all currencies are encoded. So what you do is that you extend this further, right? So I went to 2 standard deviations. So this circle or ellipse encloses 95% of all available data for all currencies. What you do is you make 4 standard deviations, right? And you see how well it is. So the way you do it is examine what happens outside this ellipse, which I didn't do in this report. Well, in fact, I can do it actually quite easily, right? So I can, again, we're kind of running out of time here, so I need to get back to the presentation. You just, in the script, you just say n sigma, right? This is, sorry, apologies. I know what the problem is. You know what? I changed to 1 sigma. That's why I didn't get this report, right? And I still got the 2-dimensional report. So my apologies. I changed the number of standard deviations from 2 to 1, right? Instead of changing the dimension from 2 to 1. And that explains why I got the 2-dimensional report and could get the 1-dimensional report. So just operator error. Right, no problem. So you're just going to run, right? So you can just put 4 here, right? And you will basically see that it's still pretty reasonable, right? And of course, if you put 10, it's probably going to get eventually crazy, right? But you want to make sure that whatever a lot of standard classical models, right? When you go 2-3 standard deviations, they produce actually pretty unrealistic behavior. Normal models tell you that minus 5% short rate can occur in 30 years from now. So, this is perhaps the example of, the proverb, in land of the blind, one-eyed man is king, right? So you may think it's bad, right? But think about what the classical models do, right? They're even less realistic. So I think Autoencoder do absolutely splendid outside the range of the data. I could see that, 2, 3, 4 standard deviations, they're still pretty reasonable. And I think that actually is another good thing about them. All right. So with that, let me go back to the. So what I'm running right now will produce the same report that Svetlana just sent me. So we already went through it. So let me now go to the second session. Again, any more questions? Please put them in the chat. I'll try to answer. And with that, we're switching to real-world models. All right. So real-world models, right? So, this is the last session, this is a shorter session, second shorter session today because we took more time on risk-neutral models, where we discuss models in the real-world measure. Right. First of all, why model?
Alexander, could you please go to full screen mode?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, you're right. So why? Can you see that? Why model interest rates in real-world measure? Well, there are some, few reasons, right? And some of these reasons are, existed for a long time, and some of them are gaining increased importance recently. So I think at this point, the main reason to model interest rates in real-world measure is the limits, right? So in order to calculate the limits, the most sophisticated way to manage limits is not using add-ons, but using potential future exposure. And potential future exposure is a quantile of exposure, right? So when you compute XVA, you compute the expectation of positive or negative exposure, so positive XVA, negative DVA. And when you need limits, you use quantile of potential future exposure in real world measure, right? So your simulation should be real world, otherwise it would not be any accurate. Now, for insurance companies, economic scenario generation, that's kind of always was there, right? But now is regulators are requiring more of these calculations. So for insurance companies, economic scenario generation requires interest rates models decades in the future, because the insurance company, when you buy insurance policy, it needs to invest the money, and in order to determine how much to charge you for the policy, it needs to know how much interest it will earn with what probability. And insurance companies don't care about what traders think about the risk, right? They want real world probability. And finally, in macro investing, long time horizons are essential for both portfolio construction and risk. And likewise, when you're investing, right, you want the real probability, not increase or decrease probability just because the trader is risk averse or is seeking. So there are two categories of real world models. Classical models in P measure, they fall in real world measure, they fall in two broad categories. So the first category are the models originally developed for pricing and risk neutral measure, where risk neutral drift is replaced by real world drift, and market implied volatility is replaced by historical volatility. So you take your risk neutral model, change the drift, change the volatility, you're done, right? The second category of models are the models that adopt a parsimonious curve fit, such as Nelson-Siegel or Nelson-Siegel-Svensson, and build a statistical time series for its parameters. You may notice that I am not mentioning things like historical VAR, expected shortfall, used for market risk. And that's because it's not really a model, right? So when you directly sample from historical data, that's historical simulation. And you can only do it when you have a very large number, hundreds at least, of non-overlapping risk horizons in your time series. So for market risk, your risk horizon is 1 day or 10 days, right? And then you have hundreds or sufficient number of, even for a single currency, of these risk horizons in your time series. When we're talking about things like limits, insurance, macro, we're talking years and decades in the future. So if our horizon is 30 years and our time series is 20 years, well, obviously there's not much we can do. So that's why we need the model. We need the model because we calibrate to a shorter time horizon, and then we extend it to a longer time horizon. And autoencoders can be used to perform optimal dimension reduction for both model categories. Now, just simulating the rates in real-world measure is not enough. You also need to value the portfolios. Because irrespective of measure, no interest rate model SD can incorporate every market code required to price a large portfolio. For example, you can use Nelson-Siegel to forecast, and have basically a statistical forecast model for the Nelson-Siegel parameters, and you will produce various shapes of the yield curve, but you will not produce any shapes of the volatility, right? So if you're going to price a callable swap, Nelson-Siegel real-world model will not tell you the volatility that you need to use, right? And you should not be using today's volatility with the future higher or lower yield curve. So irrespective of measure, no interest rate model can incorporate every market code or directly, right? Even if it does if it incorporates the entire yield curve shape, it will not incorporate the volatility. But risk neutral simulation model can price the remaining, the reference instruments for the missing market codes. For example, you can use your risk neutral simulation model to price swaptions and obtain volatility surface at a future time. Or you can just directly price portfolio trades. A real world simulation model cannot do that because it does not have market price or risk. So it must be paired with a separate risk neutral pricing model for this purpose. So the two models, one in P measure and the other in Q measure, must share the same state variables, because once you generated real world distribution of the state variables, you then need to plug the state variables into your risk neutral model to produce either prices or market costs which are missing, like volatilities. So this is the illustration for this, right? So the real world model in P measure is used before the risk horizon, right? If you're interested in distribution, if you're interested in potential future exposure at this horizon, what you want to do is to generate a real world simulation of market risk factors up to the horizon, and then price portfolio at this horizon. So your real world model is used before the risk horizon. Your risk neutral model is used after the risk horizon. and prices are mapped at risk horizon. And to map the prices, you need the shared state variables. So when we built risk neutral 1 and 2 factor short rate models using the autoencoders, what we need to do is to take the same model, but now use a different drift, such that the state variables of these models, well, in this case, it's either the short rate or the point in latent space, which in case of 1 factor model is the same thing, right? In case of 2 factor, you need the point 2-dimensional point in latent space. They're shared between the 2 models. Now, in real world measure, you don't have market implied calibration. When you do market implied calibration, you take into account the market price of risk, and you don't want to do that. That would create bias in real world measure. And the central assumption of historical calibration is that no observation data is special, right? So in other words, if you're calibrating, let's say to 10-day, 1 year, or 2 year time horizon, you're saying, well, you're going to have various horizons, various historical points, and the whole point of historical calibration is that you're mixing them all together and then inferring the information about distribution. So no point in time is special. And that naturally leads to time homogeneous model specification. So time homogeneous or stationary, the terms which I will use interchangeably, means that model parameters do not depend on model time t, right? So in Hollow-White model or AGM model or any other model, in risk neutral measure, you need to feel the shape of the yield curve observed today, and you need to calibrate to the shape of volatilities surface or specific volatilities observed today. And there is a term structure to them, right? They're in different maturities. And the reason this happens is because traders have different views of risk. They have different views of the future, movement of the rates, as well as different views of risk at different horizons, right? So a trader may think that the rates will not rise in the next month, but they will rise in next year, right? And another trader will think, well, not the next year, but the next 5 years, even though probably these traders are, I would say, given the recent, spike in inflations, that probably not a lot of traders would think that, right? As an aside. So we don't want to calibrate the real world measure model to market implied data. But or rather, if we do, then we still need to use the history. And actually, sorry, I didn't plan to mention it, but actually, there's a John Hull, Alan White, and I wrote a paper actually about how you can do it. But you need the history, right? You can't just calibrate to today's market implied data. You need the history of market implied data, then you can use it, right? But I'm not talking about it here. So, so the time homogeneous calibration can only be used in real world measure, right? In risk neutral measure, it will not be arbitrage-free. And okay, my page is stuck. Okay, now it's unstuck. Right, so the time homogeneous model calibration, we can specify it using the probability density for a fixed horizon, right? So let X be the set of state variables of the model, and such that the model stochastic process is Markovian in X, right? And that does not preclude path dependence in a conventional sense, right? Because any such path dependence will become part of the state variables. Stationary calibration is performed, or time homogeneous calibration is performed for a specific calibration horizon tau. If we assume time homogeneity, if we assume that we calibrate to the historical data and today is no special, right? It's just like any other historical point. And again, no special does not mean that you don't depend on what the rates are today. It means that if the rates today are the same as the rates were 1 year ago, then you will consider the eventual evolution of rates 1 year, back to be a valid sample from today's probability, right? So in other words, if there are 2 days in a time series where rate levels for the state variables are the same, they will have the same future probability. It does not mean that you will just take average evolution of rates for all historical points and mix them all up together, right? It does not mean that. So you still, so it's not like market risk where you mix everything together and take the quantile. The probability P depends, it does not depend on time explicitly, but it does depend on the rates today. So it depends on time through the level of rates today, right? Only through that. So actually that was on a slide, right? So so the dependence of P on the initial state is key to successful use of the model, because that's actually what mean reversion. Where mean reversion will appear. So we can calibrate this probability density, conditional probability density, to pairs of original and lagged state variables, right? So you have state variables today, or rather, let's say 1 year back, and state variables 1 year back less 1 month, right? So you take pairs of state variables at a point in time and the same point in time plus tau. Original variable, lagged variable. And you can calibrate the probability distribution of the model in real world measure to the historical data pairs. Now, once we do that, we can use the probability chain rule to obtain probability density over n calibration horizons, right? Because essentially what we do is that if we have, let's say, a calibration horizon is tau, to do calibration horizons of n times tau, we simply make a convolution of this probability with itself over n time periods. And for n goes to infinity, the initial state is forgotten, and the result is equilibrium distribution that no longer depends on the original time, and only depends on the final state. So, sorry, an initial state, and only depends on the final state, right? So if you are interested in what probability distribution of interest rates your model will predict, let's say 1 million years in the future, it will not depend on the rates today. They will be forgotten long before that. In fact, normally it forgets after about 10 or 20 years, right? So, you know, the rates today, they have nothing to do with what Carter did or what Reagan did, right, in the United States. It's long forgotten, right? So the history is gone. So eventually it should produce, the model should produce a reasonable and well-behaved equilibrium density. By the way, a lot of standard models don't do that, right? And Autoencoder market models are a lot better. Why? Because if it didn't do that, it would not. By training to the historical data, essentially, they like to stay within the envelope of the historical data. So how do we apply the same approach that we just applied to risk-neutral models now to real-world models? Well, first of all, what is the classical counterpart that we will build from? By the way, we have a lot of questions, right? So suddenly the floodgates have opened, and we have a lot of questions, but I'll answer them at the end because we only have 15 minutes left. So the precursor of Hollow White model is the Vasicek model, right? So it's time homogeneous model, but with the same terms, right? Normal stochastic driver and mean reversion with constant speed. But it's a time homogeneous model, right? So it was originally proposed for the risk neutral measure, but as Hull and White pointed out, it was not arbitrage-free, right? So in other words, it did not reproduce bond prices or swap prices. And however, for historical calibration, which is time homogeneous based on the principle that no data is special, we come back to this original time homogeneous formula. So it becomes, again, not Hollow White, but Vasicek. But we use it in the real world measure, even though it was intended originally for risk neutral measure. And at decades long time horizons required by PFA data calculations, drift is not drowned out by volatility and must be estimated, right? So estimating real world drift is a long-standing problem in quant finance. When I was starting in quant finance, in 1996, believe it or not, right? A long time ago. It's still, everybody say, oh, it's a long-standing, it's a very difficult problem. Nobody knows how to solve it. Very old problem. This problem was long-standing in 1996, right? We're still not really solved comprehensively. But I feel that we're making some progress toward it, and including using this method, right? So how do we solve it? Well, sometimes it's solved by just saying you use the risk-neutral drift. That's actually a bad idea because the reason long-term rates are higher than short-term rates is the market price of risk, right? If not for the market price of risk, the average 30-year bond yield would be the same as swap yield, would be exactly the same as the OS rate, right? Because rates move in a finite range, and without the market price of risk, the swap rate is actually just the average of the short-term rate over the 30-year period. So using risk-neutral drift instead of the real-world drift is a really bad idea for the rates. It will create positive drift where your short rate will go up. Like in risk-neutral measure, you advance toward the forward, which is higher. In real-world measure, you shouldn't, right? In fact, the long-term drift of the short rate is, so any fixed maturity rate is zero. Or by assuming a zero drift, also a bad idea because it's zero on average over 1 million years, but certainly not zero at any point in time. If the rates are negative today, they can only go up, and mean reversion pulls them up, right? And eventually we'll escape. In fact, we already escaped. We're escaping right now the liquidity trap, right? If the rates are very high today, then of course they will come down eventually. So the real world drift has to be estimated, and it's definitely not zero. It's also different from the risk neutral drift. Using either of these would be a significant error. So we can estimate it using this method that we just developed by just taking the calibration horizon a little bit longer than we used to, right? So we use the daily horizon, monthly horizon. Now we're going to use 2-year horizon. Why? Because at shorter horizons, drift is drowned out by volatility, and we want to estimate it. Okay, and by the way, why are we estimating drift? Well, remember, Autoencoder, we applied it in risk neutral measure to improve how the drift is modeled, right? So now we're doing the same, but now we need to estimate it differently. In risk neutral measure, we estimated the drift from the yield curve. That was easy. Now we have to work harder, but we can still do it. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the mean lagged short rate as a function of today's short rate, which is given by this expression where p tau is the probability of conditional probability of future rate, and the integral is taken over the future rates. In the Vasicek model, this is linear in the rate, right? So Vasicek model is a result of having normal volatility and constant speed of mean reversion. It gives us a very simple linear expression, right? So, it's linear with a slope less than 1. And now this is how it looks in the historical data. That's, by the way, combines all currencies. And unless you think that mean reversion is the same in all currencies, which some people do, because often people just say, well, mean reversion is 5% across the board. So sometimes you do think that or assume that mean reversion is the same. But even if you don't, this just gives us the idea, right? Because the full model, which we don't have time to discuss, of course, but similar to the Autoencoder, you can provide. I spoke about it at conferences with Alexei Kondratyev before. So you can provide one-hot encoding of the currency and actually have a currency-specific regression there as well. But this is just to kind of show the overall form, right? So it looks like this, right? And of course, humans are not great at averaging dense cloud of points. So black dashed line is just the mean for each 2% bucket. Green is the median, right? So you can see that it's really not very skewed. And red is machine learning, which is really not much than just smooth, doesn't do much more than just smoothing the bucket averaging, right? And the yellow shaded area is one standard deviation envelope around the data. Okay, so well, one thing is that the mean is not linear, right? So I'm not actually. I thought I had the. Okay, so I guess I don't have the slide how to interpret it, but Vasicek model predicts that the mean of this graph will be linear, right? So it's a straight line, but it's not, right? It becomes flatter here. Why does it become flatter? Because the mean reversion becomes faster for higher rates, right? And why wouldn't it? The central bank is fighting, basically when the rates are 20%, the economy is huge trouble, right? So the central bank is fighting it with everything they got. And it turns out that historically, when the rates go very high, they reach lower rates again, much faster than you would get by assuming it's still the same 5% mean reversion that you normally put in EU model typically, right? Today, in fact, it's even lower if you calibrate. So what's interesting is that both the risk neutral mean reversion and the real world mean reversion are higher for higher rates. And they don't have to be, right? They don't have to be, because the difference between them is a market price of risk. And nobody said that market price of risk is the same at all rate levels. In fact, it's not. So it could easily be that one of them would be high and the other one is low, right? Or one of them constant across all rate levels and the other one is not. But it's encouraging that when one goes up, the other goes up, because these two drifts or mean reversions, they have the shared component, which has to do with where the rates are heading, right? If the rates today are 15% or 20%, the rate in 2 years, the mean of the rate in 2 years will be around, between 10 and 15, right? So if the rate today is between 15 and 20, the rate in 2 years will be between 10 and 15. It will go down a lot, right? More than 5% per year. And you can make this conclusion by analyzing this in real world measure, or by analyzing yield curve shapes in risk neutral measure. And that's good because there's a shared component to this drift because the yield curve is determined by what the traders think about what the rates would go. And this is where they historically went. So this is the shared component. The different component, which is only present in risk neutral measure, is the market price of risk, is the extra drift that real world measure does not have. But given this very strong effect where drift really increases, downward drift is really increases tremendously when the rates go above 15%, it's not surprising that it's seen in both measures, right? Because the market price of risk correction, there are two things, basically there are two terms. One of them really changes a lot, and the other one, we don't know how it changes, but clearly, if one changes, then the sum will also probably change the same way, right? So that's actually is kind of another, because these are totally and utterly different estimation procedures, right? So one is analysis of the shape of the yield curve, and the other is analysis of what the short rate would go, with a 2-year lag. So very encouraging, and I think it's a good argument in favor of the model. All right. Anyway, so this is one-dimensional currency-specific results, and this are two-dimensional currency-specific results where eventually everything, these are the cloud of points that eventually drift toward the yellow dot, which is the long-term average of the 3-month rate and the 10-year rate. So the parameters here are not the latent space, but the 3-month and the 10-year rate. And finally, we have a couple of minutes for the whole curve models, and I will answer questions, right? So whole curve models, right? So that's actually, save for the last, the simplest application of autoencoders. So so Nelson-Siegel and Nelson-Siegel-Svensson are the de facto standard in parsimonious modeling or parametrization of the yield curve. They're both expressed in terms of the zero coupon continuously compounded rate, which is simply the average of the instantaneous forward rate. Now, the formula that's kind of pretty complicated, right, that you normally see is for the zero rate, but in fact, it has its origins in the forward rate, and it's a lot better to think of it or work with it in the forward rate space, because this is how we derive the short rate models, the GM model, and this is the natural form. So I wish they didn't express it in terms of the zero rate, because it just confuses things. All right. So when Nelson and Siegel wrote the paper, if you go back to the original papers, they actually started from this form, which they later rejected, right? So they said that the forward rate is the sum of two exponential terms plus a constant. Okay, well, that's interesting because we've seen it before, right? Remember, first session, right? Two-factor Holland-White is exactly the same, right? So in fact, the G2++ gives you the same form if phi is constant and there is no dependence of basically if it's time homogeneous. So Nelson and Siegel started from the two-factor Holland-White form of the forward rate. And then they said, well, too many parameters, right? 5 parameters, 2 ways, throw 3 ways to mean reversions. So they said, okay, so we're going to assume that the 2 reversions are very close to each other. This is actually totally opposite to what two-factor Holland-White does, because in two-factor Holland-White, one reversion is fast and one is very slow. Nelson and Siegel assumed that they're very close to each other and did Taylor expansion and the difference. So they obtained this form. And when you integrate this form over time, that's what then you get their formula for the zero rate. So that's the classical canonical Nelson-Siegel, but for the forward rate. And there is a simple interpretation to it as the constant, slope and curvature, right? So this is the constant. This is basically is a constant term, decaying term. And the term you see is linear in T minus T, so it first goes up and then it comes down. Okay, one thing about it, by the way, is that this is not a valid form, strictly speaking, right? Because the console rate, what other this is the form in which the parallel shift eventually basically if you start converting it into volatilities of the if you start converting it into shifts in the HEM model, you'll get in trouble because what you don't want is the constant, right? But let's just we don't have time to go into detail on that, right? So the 3 terms have simple interpolation. There are a total of 4 parameters, right? Of which you vary 3 during the model use, and one of them, the mean reversion speed, is fixed, right? And Nelson-Siegel-Svensson term adds another linear term with a different beta 4 and another mean reversion. So it has 6 parameters. Okay, well, the definition of parsimonious, right, is, you know, unwilling to spend money on user resources, right? So basically still the minimal, right? So, well, if you're trying to fit the yield curve with high accuracy and eliminate, you know, originally it was developed for eliminating liquidity-related noise in the bond yields. In there, 4 to 6 parameters is parsimonious. It's a lot fewer than the points on the curve. But when our goal is to describe swap curve evolution, is 4 is extravagant and 6 is unheard of, right? You know, anybody remember 6-factor models back in the days of heyday of structured derivatives? You know, people say, well, you know, I have a 3-factor model, I have a 4-factor model. Nobody's saying I have a 6-factor model. That's crazy, right? So for our purpose, the Nelson-Siegel and Nelson-Siegel-Svensson are grossly overparameterized. They have too many parameters. The latent space, quote unquote, is too big. So what we're going to do is to use exactly the same methodology as Nelson-Siegel, but with autoencoder that is lower dimensional, right? And that is how you use the autoencoder with the Nelson-Siegel framework or the curve basis framework. And that concludes the real-world model section. You know, we have a few minutes for questions. So please keep asking questions. You know, we don't really have a need to stop exactly in 3 minutes. So I'll keep answering them until there are questions. And of course, anybody who is pressed for time can leave. Let me just go through them, right? So which changes I needed to apply this method to shorter rate periods, 30 days, 60 days? Well, no changes. I mean, you need, sorry, the person who asked the question, can you clarify, are you talking about the calibration horizon or you're talking about curve maturities? It's Marcus, a question from Marcus. Marcus, curvature, right? So yeah, no changes. You just essentially, you know, we just to keep things simple, we just use the swap rates. So our shortest point is 2 years, but you don't even, strictly speaking, you don't even need to normalize the basis, right? You can just put basically any shorter instruments. Is there a paper about this work? Well, my goal was to finish it at the same time as I finished preparation for the workshop. But having to choose between the two, I decided that I better finish the slides, right? So very shortly, I hope to post it, you know, within a week or two. You know, hopefully I can provide it to the slides. Yeah, so the paper is almost finished, but need a little bit more polishing. How sensitive are the results to the choice of historical time window? Not sensitive at all. In fact, we trained with the embargo period. And then we, you know, got very good results on the reproduction of the embargo period. So, and also we trained with the embargo currencies, right? So it's not very sensitive to the choice of the historical window. In fact, not sensitive at all once you accumulate enough data. Furthermore, it's not sensitive to the choice of currencies. You can train on some currencies, then include other currencies, and they're still well represented. So it seems incredibly robust for 1 or for 2 dimensions. Right, probably once you go to 3-4 dimensional autoencoder, it will, you know, basically the higher dimensional, the higher is the space dimension, the further are the neighbors, and so I expect the quality will deteriorate as you have more factors. But the autoencoder makes such a good use of a small number of state variables that really don't have to. I mean, basically 2-factor with an autoencoder seems to do a lot better than 2-factor. In classical short rate models with exponential forms. I would say autoencoder saves you about 1 dimension. So think of 2-dimensional autoencoder as being as good as 3-dimensional parametric basis. All right. Let me see. Any other questions? Okay, so we have, okay, so I understand, right? You can simulate real world rates by SD or by Nelson-Siegel. Have you detected any advantage to each one? Yeah, so these are really very different ways to do it. It's sort of like, it's hard to argue about the advantages of, let's say, short rate framework versus, you know, forward rate framework. And in fact, there are some cases, edge cases where they're equivalent. So I think, you know, there is actually, even though it's about risk neutral measure, there is an excellent paper by Leshenko and Gonchar Goncharov, where they talk about how to basically about the connection between AGM and the parametric basis, right, in risk neutral measure. Now, in real world measure, it's a lot simpler connection. Essentially, it's I would say in real world measure, because there is no arbitrage condition, they're in a sense almost the same, meaning that if Nelson Siegel did not discard the initial form they had, right, and went with it, then the dynamic Nelson Siegel model would really be not much different from stationary G2++ model or two-factor hollow weight with time-homogeneous calibration. So the real world measure models, the difference between the short rate models and the curve basis models is really not that significant. It's kind of pretty bizarre, right? Because they're formulated in a different way, but the Nelson Siegel and similar models, they're based on a parametric form for the forward curve shape. In the short rate models, define trajectories of the short rate, but up to the convexity correction, the trajectory of the short rate in the short rate model is the same as the forward rate shape. So if you use the same exponential term in both, right, you actually end up with a very similar model up to a small convexity correction. So I would say there are more commonalities between them. There are more similarities than differences. And I think it just depends basically what you like to do. I mean, I think in the end, there's just two different ways to describe the same dynamics. And when you use the autoencoder, you apply the same improvement to both model types. Okay, I hope I answered. Continuing my question, what should we change in training for the shorter periods, right? Okay, so for the shorter periods, basically, if your objective is to do statistical inference, which is a fancy way to say estimation of probability distribution of the volatility term, then you should in fact train on daily volatility, because the shorter the better, the more data points. We only trained on longer periods because we wanted to estimate the drift. And the reason we wanted to estimate the drift is because the drift becomes, in risk neutral measure, is the shape of the curve. And here the drift determines the behavior of the curve over long time horizons, right? So if we don't estimate the drift, we don't estimate the mean reversion. And if we don't estimate the mean reversion, then our model does not have a reasonable equilibrium distribution, right? So without mean reversion, our rates at long 30, 40-year time horizons, and we need these horizons for limits in modern finance, they'll be plus 30%, minus 10%, right? Not good. So we need mean reversion. So the only reason we're using long time horizon is to capture the mean reversion without being drowned out by volatility. So 1 year is probably the shortest you can do as well. If you do 5, you just don't have enough historical data. Then you just have too few samples. So 2 years seem to be like a good balance, right? But if you estimate the volatility, then just go to daily. Same method. Any more questions? When pricing derivatives, the volatility is Sabre type, also by using variational Autoencoder. Yeah. So you can take this drift and build LMM Sabre, where LMM is using this drift, right? So you can do that. In this case, because what we are doing is can coexist with what Sabre extension of LMM is doing, right? Because first of all, we're building, and actually let me answer in two ways, right? So first of all, can you use Autoencoder to replace Sabre? And I touched on it in the first session yesterday. You can, but it will not do you any good, because if everybody uses Sabre, your price will just be off. So I think that if we just for the first time starting to trade options on interest rates, and you say, what is the right model? You would say, well, let's, we traded without the model. Let's see what the smiles were. And now we have a model for interpolation, right? But when everybody's using Sabre, we should use Sabre, right? So that's why we didn't really apply it to kind of replace Sabre, right? Okay, so because Sabre is also a parametric fit, right? Nobody thinks that volatility of volatility is constant and is exactly CV, right? So it's just in the end, it's a kind of parametric form rooted in parametric form founded in a reasonable assumption, which ensures that it has the right limits, right? That's what Sabre is. So what we're doing is term structure model, and term structure model with stochastic volatility is LMM Sabre or its modifications. And what we're doing does not interfere with what Sabre is doing. Sabre is modifying how the volatility is treated, and we're modifying how the drift is treated. In LMM framework, drift is the dependence of principal components of volatility shocks on maturity. Whereas in Sabre, where modeling is dependent on the strike. So you can apply it in LMM Sabre, where the Sabre part will take care of the smile, and the autoencoder will take care of the curve shape as a function of maturity. But I haven't done it here or in a paper. Perhaps it's a future paper. Any other questions? All right,
At least not anymore in chat.
Yeah, going once, going twice. All right, sold. Right. Okay. So thank you very much for attending. It was an honor. Slides will be provided to all participants, as well as we'll send some PDF files for the calculation results. Unfortunately, I'm not able to provide GitHub repo where you can run it, but we will provide the results. And in the future, I hope to provide the GitHub repo at a future time. There will be a paper also, if anyone is coming to the Quant Summit Europe, presented there as well, and in the fall conferences. Thank you very much for attending. And I would like to thank the organizers, WBS and the Machine Learning Institute, for this wonderful opportunity to present. Thank you.